atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa, for our ongoing supporters exclusive show. And for ourselves, Justin, that means our ongoing series on contemporary political ideologies. And this week, we're going to be talking about multiculturalism. So welcome to the Multiculturalism show.
Hey, it's good to be here.
I'm not going to lie. It does feel wrong on one level to have one white, bald man from the center of the country and another white, not bald, but man
getting there
from the center of the country trying to give their best take for multiculturalism. But here we are.
You know, as somebody of 7 different European extractions, I am multiculturalism in the flesh.
You're all rolled into one. That's true.
Of all your different Europeans. Yeah. So
now,
maybe not.
Before we started, though, one of the things that we chatted about was the extent to which you have to censor yourself, Justin, on these shows. And so since this is the supporters exclusive show, I'm just wondering, are you going to censor? Are we going to have, we have a show
I feel like this
that
is
goes
a topic
uncensored?
This is a topic that I feel like deserves reference, on some level. And,
That's fair.
And also one that doesn't make me as angry as some of the other things where I want to use some of those words.
Well, look, that there is undoubtedly many truths to that. But just so listeners know, we're not done, but we are getting closer to the end of our Ideologies series. And so if you're interested in the next thing that we ought to take on, we would love for you to reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com, or especially for supporters on Discord to reach out and say, what would you like the two political scientists to do next? Because, and I think I speak for both of us on this one, Justin, like myself and Ken, I have loved doing the long form series for the exclusive shows. And so even if you don't give us anything, we're going to figure something out. So just be prepared. It'll be cool because
maybe pick something that you like. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many different things we could do. I've thought about some really cool stuff, but I'll save that for now because right now we do want to get into the show itself, multiculturalism itself. So you got to be careful, and I want to be careful with listeners as we start this off. There's multiculturalism, the thing that you observe. There's the thing, in other words, there's kind of an empirical nature to cultures, and multiculturalism is existing empirically. That's not actually what we're covering here. We're covering multiculturalism as a political ideology. So it's not just a demographic reality of a diverse society. Rather, it's this very unique, distinct normative framework that is advocating for cultural diversity in the political sphere through kinds of official recognition and accommodation. So as you might remember, we talked about this early on, what makes an ideology an ideology. It has a critique of the world, and then there's a fix for it. And that's what makes it different than the political philosophy in many ways, although there's a lot of overlap there. Ideologies are unique because they're action-oriented items. And so multiculturalism action is the promotion of cultural diversity within a political sphere. And like the other ones we've been touching on, this is a modern ideology. So it emerges most in the form that we're going to be really talking about it chiefly in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it begins in Canada, Australia, Western Europe. And what it's suggesting is it is a critique of the nation-state model, right? So in classical liberalism, it viewed citizenship as kind of this universal, I hate to use this term, but that really is what's going to get thrown around, colorblind version of citizenship and status. And multiculturalism argues that true equality requires the state to actively recognize and to accommodate for cultural differences rather than just relegate them entirely to the private sphere. And that, in fact, the nation state has always been a misnomer in that there has always been a variety of groups, but rather one the nation tends to dominate. And as a result of that domination, actually leads to bad outcomes inside of the so-called nation state. And that's the kind of the underlying good. So for multiculturalists, they're arguing that we actually need to draw attention to those differences, attach significance to them. And the other thing that's kind of it's seemingly a sideline, but it's a big piece here, Justin, is that liberalism's idea that individuals are individuals first and members of groups second is also inherently flawed. And that rather, we can only understand individuals as being inescapably shaped by their membership in a variety of particular groups or communities, most of which are ones in which they are born with. It would be impossible to think of underlying individualness of, say, my kids being raised in Oklahoma, being raised in a Christian framework, and take apart their oakiness, their Christianness, their whiteness, right? Just go down the line, because those are embedded parts of who they are. And to an extent, you might be able to massage what that is. You can't exactly just pop out of that group and suddenly go, aha, I'm not white anymore, right? It's at least in the way that we perceive whiteness in the United States, right? So that's kind of where we start. Where do you start when you think about multiculturalism as a political ideology?
Yeah, I think that's, largely spot on. And I immediately, before you started talking about that, I said, I'm going to make sure I talk about nation states, because, that's here. And I think one of the things with, your basic sort of nation state discussion or definition is that there is some squishiness in it a little bit, so I'm kind of paraphrasing, but, your standard definition kind of has a couple, three elements. It is some group of people that have something in common in a singular territory governed by a singular government, essentially. And parts 2 and 3 are pretty easy. We can set borders very easily. We understand U.S. is messy with all that federalism stuff, but, we generally understand, one government for one place. That's all straightforward. But I think there is a real difficulty with, what is that, people that are kind of one people, so kind of when I talk about this with my students a little bit, we have this idea that, we talk about nation states. We have this idea that there's a place called France and it has French people in it and it's governed by the French government. And there's a place called Uganda and it's got Ugandans in it, governed by the Ugandan government, and the Norwegians and the Swedes and, and so on and so forth. And that's all really easy at a surface level, but and again, on points 2 and 3, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you get wars when we have disputes over, what government controls which territory, but, by and large in normal times, that's a very easy thing to answer. We've got a map and here's where Canada starts, and whatnot. But that first part, the, some group of people, is a whole lot messier. And, I kind of introduced the comparative element to make it especially challenging for the for the U.S., because we are a nation largely of immigrants from different cultures and things like that. And the boundaries of those are quite squishy, who is. And that's maybe something I'd like to talk about later on is, kind of the squishiness of these categories a little bit.
Absolutely. Let's get there.
My kind of jokey line about, being, 7 flavors of European or whatever is not entirely jokey, actually, in terms of just to sometimes I come across as unserious, I think. And, to walk that back a little bit, dead serious there, is it highlights this problem, but that it's a problem for everywhere. If you look at, the history of England and the Norman invasion and things like that, it's, we've had people moving around, borders move, et cetera. And so this very concept of kind of one people, and what that entails, I think, is inherently messy. And so, I think on some level, that's something that multiculturalism, at least as the empirical regularity or the empirical observation, I think engages and I think needs to engage, because, I mean, understanding, what is the composition of the society is valuable. On the other hand, what you do with that is the more ideological part, which I think gets trickier. Because, it's certainly, it's one thing to say that, okay, we are more than one culture. We are, more than one people. But then what do you do with that? And I think that's the part that becomes really tricky, putting that into action. And where we've seen, I think, some shifts, and we see this, we talked a lot in the main show this week about immigration, but I think that's, very much part of this story. It's part of the American story writ large. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where I come at it from a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you get there, because that's where I think we need to talk about. We need to be chatting about what do you do in response to intra-nation state diversity, right? And how does that look, and what does that look like? But before we get to that, I'm going to pause this because we actually come to the end of our ad-supported preview of the show.
And what's coming next is going to be so exciting, you should pay for it.
Exactly. Listen, that's, and not just this, but all the things, right? Like, I mean, you get this show, you get to get the things on the Federalist Papers. And I'm going to say, you tease a little bit there, but I've been listening. I listen to podcasts too, right? I don't just listen to the politics guys. And I have found as I've gotten older, my tolerance for flashiness has decreased. And so there'll be some shows that I listen to and I'll just think, I can't take this because you're trying to be kind of the everything Joe Rogan show. And I don't have time for that. And I really do think that there's something fun to be said about kind of the I don't want to call it boring, but the methodical look through things in an honest way. So if you like that, and if you'd like to join that methodical look through things like Ideologies or like the Federalist Papers, become a supporter of the show. That's my honest pitch. I don't think I can be any more honest than that. Is we methodically think carefully about things in open ways, and we want you to join part of that. And if you want to, you can join us on Discord and do that too. And if you don't, you just get to listen. And I think that's a lot of fun. I think there's a unique space for that. So yes, become a supporter of the Politics Guys. And to do it, it's really easy. Head down to the show notes, click on the show note link, or head to politicsguys.com/support. And like I mentioned before, if you're not in a financial position to support the show at this time, you can always reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com. And if you do that, we can get you set up. Now, it's always helpful if you subscribe, rate, and review the show. Obviously, you're probably not just going to, share this particular episode since, you're going to get all 15 minutes. But if you haven't already, please rate and review us. That makes a big difference in those algorithms. And I want to give, as always, a giant shout out to our executive producers. They are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. And if you don't become a supporter, we will be back with a full show this weekend. I hope you'll join us then. And Sean Fugit. We'll be back with our full episode this weekend. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,